So when you look at IBM helping form the Linux Foundation with 16 other partners back in December 2015, the focus for us was to try and get a standards-based play, and that's a open source, open standard, but probably more importantly, open governance play, where we get multiple participants, across different industries, both technology and be it financial services or government or distribution or retail. And having those multiple participants, I think, is governing the direction of the technology and influencing where it's going, bringing their best and brightest ideas. No one company has all the brightest people. So for us, it's that open source, open standard, open governance play. And, the great thing for us is there's a large number of financial institutions who were there at the very beginning. We're up to over 80 participants now contributing funding and work and, influencing where this code is going. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And it's not just the financial services industry that have adopted this, it's many others, right? If you look at the question of does open standards, open governance give you better security, I think the more eyes you have looking at a code base, thinking about how it's going to be utilized in their industry space, their reflection on security and priority and what's important for them, just means you get, better eyes on a problem, right? So if it was just the IBM engineers looking at that would be good, but if you can have 80 other companies with their engineers looking at the code and the security aspects of vulnerabilities as well, I think that's only positive. And we've seen this in other open plays. The more participation you have, the more you are able to counteract and potentially predict, security exposures. So one of the things that we've seen as we started looking at blockchain capabilities, and when we started this journey back in early 2015, we kind of looked at all the different Fabric implementations out there, and we sort of want to understand what was important to us. And the core business values, there's a couple of technical underpinnings with privacy and pluggable consensus, but the important thing was this idea of shared ledger and smart contracts. And I think the questions we're going to have to work through, and as we look to smart contracting in the future, there's always going to be questions about, is there going to be industry-specific languages? Is there going to be industry-specific contract wording? And I think we've got to run those engineering projects and look at those real-world uses of smart contracts. Companies are asking, good questions. They're starting to sit there and say, well, what's the legal basis of these? Can we codify those legally, and are they implementable and enforceable and everything that goes with that? And I think that shows a staggering amount of maturity in such a very short amount of time. So I think smart contracts, we are an area that's going to continue evolving, but that's really where the business value is. If you think about companies, be it in finance or insurance, they want to tackle their business processes and business problems, and they want to codify that in some kind of, contracting language. The fact they have the shared ledger and the plumbing underneath that isn't really what they're interested in. So I think, the shift over time and the focus for industry and the different industries is going to be around this smart contracting capability and how they're going to utilize it and how they're going to leverage it, and how they make it interoperate with their existing environments. Because, blockchain is not going to be implemented in a vacuum. It's not going to be, I stand up a blockchain infrastructure. It's going to be, how does it operate with my mobile payment platform, or, my client interaction platform, or my transaction processing or messaging, or, the list continues on and on. So it won't be just that isolated view of the world. It has to be an end-to-end kind of integration play. So, one of the challenges as we started looking at, the blockchain technology, we looked at all the different Fabric implementations that are out there, be it, Bitcoin native or Ethereum or Ripple or credits or Colorcoin. The list is quite extensive. And one of the challenges we saw was, there's a lot of focus on, peer-to-peer permissionless networks where you don't know who you're dealing with. There's no linkage to identity. That's quite an interesting concept. And for us, when we started having conversations with clients and businesses, because dominantly that's the world that we operate in as a company, and most companies do, their world, their business networks, you have to have this idea of understanding who you're transacting with, right? So not to say that we don't think there's some business space or business market around B2C. The problem there is, the linkage with identity, understanding who you're transacting with. And in this, one of the strong focus areas for Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general at the beginning was this idea of, we want a permissionless network. There's no central governance control, and we can do this anonymously. And our view was, for the B2B world, that's really not tenable. Because in the B2B world, we've got to be able to do anti-money laundering, KYC, know your client, customer, whichever words you want to use. You can't deal with Todd Frank in the US or any of those other regulatory controls. And, when B2B is operating, there's very few unregulated industries in the world, in the Western world, right? Because you have to worry about anti-money laundering, right? When we start talking about large numbers. So when we started looking at that, we realized that we had to have a permission network, okay? And for us, the focus is in the B2B world, right? Certainly initially. And our view is if we can drive that permission network in the B2B world, we think there's going to be huge value for those business networks, right? In being able to transform and potentially modernize very long-running and old processes that really have had a very low degree of trust. So the question you're asking really is what is going to be the organizational impact of blockchain being deployed? Clearly, some of the intermediary organizations in companies and also in business networks are going to be impacted. When you can drive up trust and increase transparency, you can take out a lot of intermediary groups and steps. But I would say that's a classic business, innovation and business change. We've been through this for centuries. I think the question is, can you then refocus and reorientate those staff to start looking at, well, how do I broaden participation? How do I have a play and interact with more people? Therefore, I need different contracting terms or smart contract language or different interaction methods. So yes, some people are going to be impacted by this. If I look at the organizations, it's any organization that starts looking after shared reference data, audit, compliance, risk management, governance. We kind of talked about in this unorganized conference the need. The organizations are changing. You can't throw enough people to govern and control what is quite an organic organization, right? And the more contact points and interaction points you have, then the more governance and management control you have to have over the top. So I think automating that and making it near real time means you can free up staff to do other things, right? But that's a process we've been through for centuries, right? Since we were back to the Luddites and everything else. So I think that's always a concern. But I would say it's not going to happen overnight. Technology innovation and change never does happen overnight, and that will be something we're going to gradually work through. But I think people are going to have to change roles. But it's things like contract departments, legal reviews. I look at things like the real estate industry. That's going to quite radically change with blockchain technology, right? Any notary actions, things like that. So I think there's a lot of change coming, but as ever, there will be, I don't think the impact on people will be instantaneous. And as ever, the view and hoping is if you broaden participation, there's new roles, new opportunities, and new business ideas and networks you can build. So, you know, your view of platforms, and if you use a platform player as say Uber or Facebook, you know, your question really is, will blockchain potentially change those worlds and, you know, in some ways even disintermediate them, right? I think potentially it could. I think more interestingly would be, you know, what are the new business networks that can form as a result of blockchain, right? Can you start playing primary and secondary market about renewable energy generation on a group of homes in an estate, you know, where they're all participating in that network and appalling a better, you know, deal from the energy utility companies because they're all grouping together and managing and self-managing and coordinating. So I think the fundamental thing, I don't really view, you know, blockchain per se as a platform. I view it as and, you know, we were quite careful when we say this word, we kind of view it as a fabric, an underpinning, a technical capability. And then people will build different business networks on top of that fabric. And it's those different business networks and how they interact and how they drive value for the end players in that broad community or that closed community that's really going to change the business processes that they're transacting and interacting with. And I think in incredibly innovative ways in the future. You know, how does blockchain deal with the computational workload and you know, what could be the long-term implications of this for failure? You know, what could slow blockchain down or cause issues for it in the future? There's kind of 2 points to this. You know, and again, you know, it's our considered view is blockchain is the technical underpinnings for Bitcoin. You know, Bitcoin is kind of the first application use case that proved out 15, 20-year-old technology, and they did a great job of that. The problem is it's a permissionless network, and when you have a permissionless network, the way you validate and agree consensus is proof of work, commonly known as crypto mining, and you have to have some form of currency in that network. You know, our view is most business networks are permissioned. You know who you're interacting with, you know who you're transacting with, and what their rights and roles are in that network. Therefore, you can reach consensus in much simpler, higher performant ways. You know, a couple of hundred trans a second. You know, this is not going to be, you know, credit card processing transaction rates at 25,000 a second, things like that. It's not going to replace your mobile payment platform. But as an overlay governance and risk and compliance platform, it's incredibly powerful to just get a better view and understanding of where you are at any point in time. So for us, you know, a permission network is very different. You can have different consensus mechanisms. You don't have to have any form of currency in the network because you're basically just interacting with people and flowing either data or assets. So for us, that's quite an important idea. Your question is also, well, you know, what could slow and what could stop the adoption of blockchain? We're still at the beginning of the journey for blockchain. You know, it was the twinkle in everybody's eye. You know, we only started Hyperledger 9 months ago. So I think it's come a long way in that time. I think the things that could slow it down or impact blockchain would be the failure for participation and a standards-based play. You know, I'm old enough to remember the network protocol wars of SNAR, TCP/IP, token ring bias, where we had multiple ways of doing things, and then we had, you know, internetworking protocols and mapping technologies, and that really slowed, you know, that connected world down. And really, we only saw the explosion of the internet once we got to TCP/IP, and, you know, everybody agreed that standard. And nobody pays for the TCP/IP stack anymore. You know, it's kind of given away. So for us, and certainly for me, if I think about it, what could slow it down is a failure on standards, and then we have interledgering network kind of wars and plays, and, you know, people wanting to have their own implementation or segmentation of that market. So I think, and it's one of the reasons we're running the players IBM in there. We are with the Hyperledger community. and the Linux Foundation is, if we can drive that standard, we can get multiple industries playing in that same space, because the business network isn't just, when you sit there and say, well, the banks want to talk to each other. That's kind of interesting. But in the car leasing world, the banks want to talk to each other. So do the insurance companies. So do the government vehicle licensing. Okay. So does the car company itself and the leasing company. And it just, you can have a much broader participation. And if they're all using a common kind of framework technology fabric, then that's going to really drive adoption. So I worry about that. A failure to have a standards-based play. I'd say that's the dominant one for me, because when you, again, in a permission network, you don't have to have the idea of currency or trading things. So I'm less worried about that from a security viewpoint. And again, you kind of asked the question earlier, what do I think about? Do I think the benefit of the open community is multiple eyes on this? I think, security is always going to be a concern in a permission network and, when we're shipping data around. But the more participants we have in it, again, it just adds to that equation. And if there are problems, then, we'll have to resolve those problems and move forward. So I'm not that worried at the moment. If I look at the computer science, it's well understood engineering. I think it's just going to take time, effort, and energy. And if we can have a good focus from a broad governance committee and contributors, it should go pretty well. And it's going at a good pace. But I'd also finish by saying, if I could predict the future, I'd probably be on Wall Street.